Welcome back to Real News. Well, it seems like every 4 years we hear the same claim that this presidential election is the most nasty and mean-spirited in American history. But for many historians, the 1828 race between Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams is unparalleled in its viciousness, with both candidates finding themselves on the receiving end of the attacks. Well, it's a race that raised the bar for future political mudslinging, or lowered it rather, and it's the topic of this week's Real History.
The story of the election of 1828 really begins with the election of 1824. What happened in that election was that no one received a majority of electoral or popular votes. There were 4 candidates, and the top 2 candidates were Andrew Jackson, who received the plurality of both popular and electoral votes, and John Quincy Adams, his opponent, who was in second place. The election was thrown into the House of Representatives, where it had to be decided. But a third candidate, Henry Clay, met with John Quincy Adams, and they made a deal. If Clay threw his support behind John Quincy Adams, then Adams would give him a cabinet appointment. Adams received enough votes because Clay indeed supported him, and Adams won, and Clay was appointed Adams' Secretary of State. Now, it turns out that Clay indeed supported Adams, not so much that he wanted the Secretary of State. It was that he really thought that Andrew Jackson, as a military chieftain, should not be in the White House. But for Andrew Jackson, this looked like what was called a corrupt bargain. From that point onward, Andrew Jackson really had a vendetta against the sitting president, John Quincy Adams. The 1828 election pitted the incumbent President Adams against Jackson, and it was a study in contrasts. John Quincy Adams, the son of a founding father, was part of the Massachusetts elite, and he knew 7 languages. He had gone to Harvard, but at the same time he was perceived as being kind of elitist, whereas Andrew Jackson was relatively ignorant. I mean, he was a smart man, very shrewd, had a lot of street smarts, and there was kind of a joke that he couldn't even spell his own name. But he was a tough guy, wiry. He said, "I never experienced the emotion of fear." He was a military general, the hero of the famous Battle of New Orleans, in which he defeated the British in the War of 1812. Andrew Jackson was perceived as a man of the people, even though he had a large place down in Tennessee called the Hermitage with many acres and slaves. There was a great popular enthusiasm for Jackson, and some of it was manipulated behind the scenes by Andrew Jackson himself. He was basically trying to coordinate the efforts of his followers and telling them to emphasize the elitism and the distance from the people of John Quincy Adams. And indeed, during the campaign, John Quincy Adams was charged with having purchased a billiard set in the White House with public funds. It turns out he actually purchased it with his own money. There was the charge made by the Jackson people that John Quincy Adams, when he had served as minister to Russia, had traded sexual favors of a handmaid of his to the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Alexander I, in return for political favors, and in effect that John Quincy Adams had been a pimp. This was absolutely wrong, but this was a smear campaign, and some people accepted that as accurate. His distance, really, from the common people, from the everyman Joe, that was really the most common charge against him. Adams really hated these kind of slanders against him, and so he turned the tables. Andrew Jackson, when he had married Rachel Donaldson, for 2 years had lived with her before finding out that she was not legally divorced from her previous husband. Probably he did not know that was true, but it was charged that he had lived in adultery and that she had been a bigamist. It was also charged that he was the son of a mulatto woman who was actually a prostitute who had been brought over by the British soldiers. So he was the son of a prostitute. And this was totally, totally false. Andrew Jackson, as a military leader, had actually executed 6 militiamen for desertion back during the Creek Wars. There was a handbill called the Coffin Handbill, which his opponents issued showing 6 coffins. And it was charged that he was a murderer. But, again, this was a gross exaggeration. Andrew Jackson at that time was 60 years old. He was rheumatic. He was toothless. He was very tough. He was called Old Hickory because hickory was a very, very tough, hard wood. At all these Jackson rallies, there were hickory canes and hickory sticks and hickory poles to symbolize the toughness. It was really an election of images because there was the kind of elite, so-called silver spoon John Quincy Adams versus the tough, common man Andrew Jackson. Sometimes these kind of images stick in the popular imagination. And in Jackson's case, the hickory was definitely very, very positive. And it was one of the first kind of symbols of the sort that become popularly associated with a particular candidate. Andrew Jackson wins the election pretty comfortably. Rachel Jackson, the wife of Andrew Jackson, was totally supportive of him, but she didn't really want to be in the White House. And shortly after the campaign, after he had actually won the victory and she was preparing for a victory celebration down in Tennessee, and she dropped into an inn where she overheard some people talking about her as a bigamist, and she got chest pains and she went home, and actually she died shortly thereafter. And this was a tremendous tragedy for Andrew Jackson, who thereafter wore black. He wore a ribbon in his cap, and he always drove her carriage around Washington. So he was always in memory of his wife, who he believed had been killed by this smear campaign during the election of 1828.